My name is Silas Sterling and I am 34 years old. I spent 4 years keeping daily logs for a man who believed every hour I worked was a personal favor. Raymond Kincaid stood by the wooden kitchen table with his thick black ledger open. "You are just helping out around here," Raymond Kincaid said, handing me a blank paper receipt. Those harsh words quietly set the permanent terms of my daily life. In the Kincaid household, shared labor belonged solely to the man holding the ledger. The quiet worker remained nothing more than a dependent guest. I taught kindergarten every weekday morning, managing 20 restless children in room 4. The little ones repeated everything they heard at their own family kitchen tables. I recorded every transaction with careful, methodical ink. A heavy safety deposit box sat locked inside the cold bank branch downtown. It waited patiently and quietly for the exact entry that would finally balance the books. None of them suspected the tally was quietly growing. That hidden balance sheet remains waiting for its day. Before the next part, take a second and subscribe. What was inside that safety deposit box changes everything you are about to hear, and I do not want you to miss it. I will say this plainly. There is no shouting match coming. This is a patient, quiet reckoning, and it lands harder for being quiet. While you are here, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from. Morning in room 4 began with blue chairs and small coats hanging neatly by paper name tags. I wrote down attendance and behavior in the blue daily log. Every spilled milk carton, every misplaced crayon, and every dispute over a red block went onto the page. Teaching young children requires a quiet and steady eye for noticing small shifts in daily routine and classroom behavior. Children repeat what they hear at home without understanding the heavy weight of those phrases. I listened to them talk during morning circle. They mirrored their households with startling accuracy. My years in the classroom trained me to notice patterns that most people simply walked right past without a second glance. Raymond managed the larger accounts while I kept the small daily records running smoothly. We maintained a steady rhythm in the house for many years. Every receipt had a designated place in the wooden drawer. The system felt entirely secure and normal until the totals slowly stopped matching the reality of our shared labor. The kitchen smelled of damp wood and cold coffee grounds left over from the early morning shift. Raymond sat at the bench with his heavy book open wide. He turned a stiff page. What was earned through shared labor belonged exclusively to the man holding the ledger, while every quiet worker remained entirely dependent. Around midday, Walter Cooper passed by the porch window. He paused to wipe his boots on the metal grate. The neighborhood operated on similar logic. Everyone accepted the hierarchy without question. The heavy oak door remained firmly locked against any curious outsiders who tried to question the fairness of our domestic arrangement. I kept my daily notes tucked inside the wooden drawer under the counter. My job required precision and clean ink lines. Raymond demanded a different kind of accounting for household expenses. He wrote down every grocery receipt and utility bill with a black fountain pen. Those neat black ink columns silently justified the profound financial imbalance that quietly governed our domestic life under his roof. The blue logbook from room 4 sat in my bag by the coat rack. Children brought their home language directly into the classroom rug. They repeated harsh phrases without understanding their actual weight. Adults assumed children noticed nothing. The actual hidden truth of the matter remained entirely different from what casual visitors observed during our busy morning classroom hours. A small metal safety deposit box rested on the top shelf of the hallway closet. Dust gathered on its latch. Nobody touched it except Raymond. He kept the key in his watch pocket. The strict unspoken law of the household meant nobody ever questioned his absolute control over our hard-earned shared future. Walter looked across the fence with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He nodded once. He never intervened in domestic disputes. The neighborhood watched everything and said nothing aloud. Their collective public silence provided the sturdy foundation that allowed Raymond to maintain his complete authority over the entire property. 12 years passed under this exact routine. Every Monday began with the same checklist. I taught my class and returned to the quiet house. Raymond sat at the table with his ledger. The entire system felt entirely permanent because absolutely nobody in our social circle dared to challenge the underlying financial logic. The kitchen light flickered once as evening slowly settled over the damp Sequim Valley landscape. Shadows stretched across the worn linoleum floorboards near the sink. I set my heavy canvas bag down by the back door. The ledger waited quietly for its final entry of the day. Normalcy wrapped securely around all of us like a very heavy, damp woolen blanket long before anyone noticed the approaching storm. Walter Cooper stood by the garden gate. He was 65 years old. His boots were caked with dry mud from the lower pasture. Raymond sat on the wooden bench nearby. Raymond was 62. He held his black fountain pen between two thick fingers. The afternoon air smelled of cut grass and damp earth. Walter shifted his heavy canvas jacket around his shoulders before speaking to the man on the bench. "We all have to tighten our belts until the grant clears," Raymond said. His voice was flat. Walter nodded slowly. Walter reached out and touched the rusted wire of the fence. He did not say anything against the rule. Nobody questioned the ledger when Raymond brought it up. I stood near the doorway. My daily notes were tucked inside my coat pocket. A small metal safety deposit box sat on the high shelf just inside the hall. Raymond kept the spare key in his waistcoat pocket beside his grandfather's gold pocket watch. Walter cleared his throat. He looked at the vegetable patch. "The carrots were coming in thin this season," he said. Raymond did not look up from his paper. "The soil needs more lime," Raymond said. Walter agreed with a quiet mumble. Walter was always careful not to cause trouble on the property line. He stepped back toward his own side of the fence while the cold wind rustled the dry weeds along the ditch. I watched the two men talk about dirt and weather. Neither of them mentioned the missing columns in the weekly totals. I walked back inside the kitchen. The room was dim. The heavy oak table bore the dark stains of ink spills from past years. I opened my blue notebook. I recorded the time Walter left. My entries were precise. Every single hour was accounted for in neat blue lines that ran across the page. Raymond came inside a few minutes later. He dropped his keys onto the ceramic tray by the door. The metal clinked against the glaze. He wiped his pen with a dirty rag. The afternoon shadows grew longer across the floorboards. I closed my logbook and placed it inside the wooden drawer. Nothing else happened before dusk fell over the valley. The oak surface was cold. Raymond sat opposite me. His black pen rested near the corner of the wood. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust motes in the quiet room. I placed my small notebook down. Raymond shook his head slowly. "You have misunderstood the arrangement entirely," he said. My fingers stayed flat against the grain. I waited for him to continue. "The calculation was simple. 4 years of labor meant something." Raymond adjusted his sleeves. He tapped the wood with a heavy finger. "You are maintained here as a guest," he said. The words dropped heavily into the space between us. I looked at the grain of the wood. I did not raise my voice in protest. "A guest receives what is given," he added. His tone was flat and final. "Children repeat what they hear at the kitchen table." The old truth settled over the room like dust. I thought of room 4 and my morning students. They carried their parents' sentences into the school building every single day. Raymond reached for his ledger. "You contribute very little to these walls," he said. He closed the thick cover with a sharp snap. The sound echoed off the plaster walls. The brass latch on the cabinet clicked shut across the hall. I stared at the blank lines in my notebook. Every entry I made mattered. Every shift at school was logged and accounted for. Raymond did not care about the daily record. He only cared about the totals at the bottom of his page. He picked up his porcelain cup. The rim chipped against his teeth. He took a slow swallow of lukewarm tea. The floorboards groaned under the weight of his boots. He stood up slowly from the wooden chair. He walked toward the pantry with measured steps. His gold pocket watch chain caught the light. It swung in a small arc against his vest. I remained seated at the table. The silence stretched between us without breaking. My pen lay beside the open book. The blue ink had dried completely. Sequim afternoons were always gray this time of year. The fog rolled in from the strait. It pressed against the glass panes of the kitchen window. Raymond turned around to face me again. His expression did not change at all. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. The fabric was stiff with starch. He laid the napkin beside his empty plate. The arrangement had boundaries long before today. I knew the shape of them now. They were carved into the wood by decades of habit. Raymond walked past my chair without another word. He went into the pantry and shut the heavy door. I sat alone in the fading light. The room smelled of old paper and cold tea. My hands felt entirely empty against the table. Every ledger page told a story of division. Some names belonged at the top. Other names were pushed entirely off the margin. I gathered my small notebook into my palm. The paper felt thin and fragile. I stood up from the wooden chair. The legs scraped softly against the floorboards. I walked toward the front door into the chill. Outside, the garden rose waited for Lime. Walter Cooper would be leaning on his fence soon. He would ask about the grant delays. He would wonder why the carrot crops were thin. None of that mattered inside this house. Here, the rules were written by a single hand. Every column of figures favored the man who held the pen. I stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit my face. The shadows grew longer across the grass. The hallway stayed dim. Morning hours stretched thin. I walked down the narrow strip of carpet without ever making a single sound on the dusty floorboards near the wall. My boots left no marks. The air felt cold. Shadows lingered nearby in quiet silence for a very long moment. The metal box waited. Dust covered the lid. I reached up to the high wooden shelf and lifted it down with both hands very carefully before walking away. Papers rested inside securely. Small keys gleamed softly. Everything stayed in its proper place on the sturdy table. Keys jingled softly. Paper slips rested. I began to place my daily receipts there instead of keeping them in the old wooden drawer by the sink. Classroom records needed attention. Simple rules governed everything. Proper habits mattered during difficult shifts through the long winter. Raymond stayed busy. Ink dried slowly. He sat in the front room with his ledger while the scratch of his black fountain pen filled the quiet space. Account books demanded focus. Financial totals required review. Neither man spoke of the recent changes made at the table. Walter walked past. Tools clinked together. He carried a bucket of rusted metal across the yard without looking toward the window once during his entire trip. Neighborly duties called him onward. Fences separated their properties cleanly. Cold weather approached the Sequim Valley without any further delay. Tables remained scarred. Surfaces felt cold. I cleared my personal items from the wooden tabletop because there was no argument left to have about shared space. Boundaries offered protection. Quiet withdrawal made sense. Personal records found a new home inside the metal safety deposit box on the shelf. Cards held notes. Index tabs showed. Each slip recorded attendance and behavior from room 4 while keeping the details hidden from prying eyes across the room. Teaching required discipline. Daily logs mattered greatly. Small children repeated lessons learned at home without understanding the heavy weight attached. Container lids clicked. Shadows grew long. I slid the metal box back onto the top shelf behind a row of old telephone books to keep it hidden. Storage spaces offered refuge. Order brought peace. Careful routines kept my mind focused on the children waiting in the classroom. Desks required order. Rooms needed geometry. Working in kindergarten teaches you how to arrange 20 items so nobody bumps into their neighbor during a busy morning. Classroom management provided lessons. Spatial limits mattered deeply. Proper organization kept chaos at bay while outside the winter winds began blowing. Footsteps approached slowly. Floorboards groaned once. Raymond walked down the dim passage to fetch a glass of water from the tap without speaking a single word. Domestic routines continued uninterrupted. Hallways felt narrow. Silence stretched between them like an invisible wall built out of unacknowledged cuts. Glass hit porcelain. Water ran cold. He drank in absolute silence before walking back to his account books to resume the heavy labor of the evening. Kitchen faucets dripped steadily. Shadows lengthened across linoleum. Unspoken rules governed every movement inside the Kincaid household as night fell entirely. Bedrooms felt small. Mattress springs sagged. I stepped back into my room at the end of the hall and sat down on the edge of the cotton quilt. Personal quarters offered shelter. Private thoughts remained protected. Fatigue settled deep into my bones after a long day of teaching. Wind rattled glass. Damp air drifted. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the spare metal key resting against my palm with comforting familiarity. Pockets held secrets. Small items provided anchoring. Winter storms tested the strength of every house built in this quiet valley near the water. Afternoons passed quietly. Valleys stayed still. I opened my blue notebook and began to write down the events of the day in careful and deliberate block letters. Writing brought clarity. Ink flowed smoothly. Every recorded detail matched the reality observed inside room 4 during morning circle time. Marks remained exact. Columns balanced out. I closed the cover and listened to the rain start to fall softly on the roof above the quiet hallway. Shelves held secrets. Boxes stayed shut. Sequim offered plenty of quiet places for people who wanted to be left alone with their thoughts. I have to pause and ask, Have you ever been the reliable one, the person everybody counted on and nobody thanked, right up until the day they needed someone to blame? If you have, tell me in the comments what that did to you. I am asking honestly. So much of this story is about being underestimated, and I would like to know I am in good company. Seasons shifted slowly across the valley. Rain fell against the cedar siding for months at a time. While the rain drummed against the glass, I worked in the mornings and kept my own counts in the evenings. The blue notebook filled page by page. Every receipt stayed flat beneath a heavy stone on my desk. Raymond sat in the front room with his black fountain pen. He checked his own columns every single night. He did not look at my stack of papers. Walter Cooper walked past the fence with a metal rake. The garden soil grew dark and rich with mulch. Across the property line, he paused to watch the clouds gather above the distant timberline before resuming his work. I measured the rainfall in an old tin cup. The numbers added up without errors or omissions. Every transaction found a designated space on the ruled lines. Years accumulated in stacks inside the wooden box. The metal container grew heavy on the top shelf. Dust gathered around its corners during the dry months. I wiped the surface clean with a dry rag. No one else touched the latch or lifted the lid. The school year ended and another began with new faces. Small children sat at the desks in room 4. Day after day, they traced letters in clumsy strokes across lined paper while afternoon sunlight slanted across the floorboards. They repeated phrases they heard at home without understanding them. I noted their attendance and behavior in blue ink. The routine became second nature after so much time. Walter waved from the driveway when I carried groceries inside. Raymond wore his gold pocket watch less often now, the metal chain tarnished slightly against his vest. Sitting at the heavy wooden desk, he spent hours balancing figures that refused to match despite all his careful calculations. His frustration grew quiet and contained behind closed doors. I added another row of figures to my personal ledger. The page filled from margin to margin with neat writing. Every date matched the calendar on the wall. Every delivery receipt had a corresponding line item. The accumulation required care and steady patience. Over the course of many quiet months, nothing was left to memory or casual assumption as the records grew. Time proved that structured habits endure longer than anger. Raymond coughed from the front room while writing. His hand shook slightly when holding the pen. I kept my own hands steady over the paper. The lamp cast a yellow glow across the desk. Hours slipped past midnight without interruption or notice. The valley stayed dark and quiet outside the windows. Other mornings brought heavy fog rolling off the water. The trees stood silent in the gray mist. Walking down the gravel path toward the schoolhouse door, my boots crunched over wet stones and fallen pine needles in the damp air. Inside the classroom, the chalk dust settled on blackboards. I drew guidelines for the younger students to follow. Back home, the kitchen remained cold until the wood stove caught. Raymond ate his breakfast in total silence. Looking through old invoices without speaking a single word, he kept his eyes lowered toward the checkered oilcloth tabletop. I poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug. The steam rose toward the beamed ceiling. These quiet years built a fortress out of ordinary paper. The ledger stayed locked. Every page told the truth about hours worked and hours forgotten. Raymond sat across the room with his heavy books. He never asked to see my notes. He assumed his control remained absolute because no one challenged his desk. A teacher learns to watch the quiet children in the back row. They notice everything while pretending to look at their hands. I watched him the exact same way. Walter pruned his apple trees in the late autumn frost. The metallic snip of shears carried across the property line. Raymond ignored him entirely, preferring to stare at his fountain pen. The gold plating on his watch wore away near the stem. Time ground down the edges of his authority. My own desk remained organized. Every receipt had its proper place behind a labeled tab. Years do not arrive with a crash. They settle like dust over furniture and window sills. The classroom floors were swept every single afternoon without fail. I wrote the final attendance mark with steady fingers. Outside, the rain turned to heavy snow against the cold glass. The valley grew still under a thick white blanket. Winter tested the foundations of every house on the lane. Raymond struggled with his figures late into the evening. His breathing sounded heavy in the narrow hallway. I added another row of calculations to my own stack. The numbers supported each other without a single flaw. Nothing was left to chance or guesswork. The metal box on the top shelf held every single truth. Spring returned with bright green shoots in the garden beds. Walter waved from his tractor as I walked past the fence. The children in room 4 grew taller by inches every month. They left fingerprints on the classroom glass and forgot their jackets on the hooks. I gathered the stray items and placed them neatly in the lost and found bin. Back at the desk, I turned another blank page. The blue ink flowed smoothly across the white surface. Raymond's ledger remained shut for days at a time now. He walked slower through the front room, his shoulders curved inward toward his chest. The system he built was cracking from its own weight. I kept my records without a single word of complaint. Summer evenings brought long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Cicadas hummed in the tall grass near the property line. I sat by the window with a fresh bottle of ink. Every detail of the past years remained safely contained within my files. The meticulous recording became a form of peace. Silence filled the spaces between us. We lived under the same roof as strangers sharing an unlit hallway. The records grew thicker with every passing season. Every transaction waited patiently for its moment to speak. Patience was the only tool required for the long work ahead of us. The paper never lied. The kitchen floorboards groaned under heavy steps. Raymond sat by the window in the fading light. He pulled the coarse thread hard, wincing as the small metal needle slipped against his knuckle and drew a thin bead of dark blood. I watched him from the shadowy corner by the pantry door. "These boots are worn down to nothing," he muttered quietly to himself. He looked older tonight than his 62 years suggested, his shoulders rounded and defeated by the failing light. He rubbed his stiff knees with palms stained blue by years of ink. The heavy ledger lay shut on the scarred wood table beside a cold ceramic mug. "We all have to tighten our belts until the grant clears," he said, repeating the phrase like a worn-out prayer he no longer believed. His voice lacked its usual sharp edge, sounding hollow instead of commanding. I remained silent, keeping my hands tucked inside the pockets of my teaching slacks. That familiar sentence had echoed through the valley for months. It justified every missing coin, every unpaid hour, and every empty promise made across the grain of the oak table. Yet the numbers did not support his tired excuse anymore. $14,500 sat hidden in the columns of my private blue notebook. That exact sum represented 12 years of uncredited labor in room 4 and beyond. The arithmetic was stubborn, refusing to vanish beneath his worn-out rhetoric. Raymond set the mending aside with a soft sigh. He reached for his gold pocket watch, turning the heavy metal casing over in his palm before opening the latch. The inside lid held a faded photograph of a dry field under gray skies. He stared at the tiny image for a long moment, his thumb tracing the glass. I saw a fleeting flicker of genuine exhaustion cross his face, stripping away the hard armor of the provider. For one brief second, he looked less like an absolute ruler and more like an old man trapped by his own design. The humanizing cracks in his posture did not erase the ledger's reality. Sympathy was a dangerous luxury I could not afford to keep on my desk. Walter Cooper walked past the window just then, carrying a bundle of rusted wire across the yard. The neighbor did not look inside, keeping his head down against the evening chill. Raymond closed the watch case with a sharp metallic snap that broke the quiet room. He stood up slowly, groaning as his joints popped in the stillness. I walked over to the counter after he retreated down the dark hallway. The heavy account book remained shut, hiding its fraudulent totals beneath a layer of dust. Every page I had filled during my years in the valley pointed toward a single, undeniable conclusion. The system he built was collapsing under the weight of its own invented scarcity. My daily notes from school had taught me how easily children absorb falsehoods spoken at home. They parrot whatever adults repeat often enough, turning lies into household law. The kitchen grew colder as the wood stove burned down to gray ash. I traced the edge of the metal box hidden safely on the high shelf in my mind. The keys inside jingled softly whenever heavy trucks rumbled down the dirt road outside. $14,500 was not a minor accounting error. It was a calculated erasure executed with a black fountain pen and absolute administrative confidence. Raymond believed his ledger was the only truth that mattered in this house. Room 4 required absolute precision every single morning when 20 children sat at their tiny wooden desks. I applied that exact same discipline to every receipt, invoice, and ledger column I maintained in secret. The lie was straining now, stretching thinner with every passing week of manufactured poverty. He could no longer afford new boots, yet he clutched his control tighter than ever. I turned away from the dark window and walked toward the hallway stairs in absolute silence. We are almost at the turn, so let me ask. Have you ever watched someone simply assume you would stay silent forever, only because you always had? If you have, drop a comment and tell me how it ended for you. Then stay right here with me, because staying silent was never the same thing as forgetting, and I remembered all of it. Raymond left a signed paper on the kitchen counter. It was a formal letter drafted with his black fountain pen. The ink had a faint purplish sheen under the morning light. He demanded absolute surrender of the property records. This document will settle every lingering dispute between us, he said without looking up from his coffee cup. I did not touch the paper immediately. My hands stayed flat on the wooden surface. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and damp wool from his heavy sweater. A teacher learns to read intention beneath surface errors. He had signed his full name at the bottom with heavy pressure. That signature sealed his exact financial narrative on paper for the first time. The margins contained detailed monetary figures claiming exclusive ownership over 12 years of shared labor. His overreach was complete, total, and entirely self-incriminating in ink. I walked down the dim hallway toward the high shelf. The metal box waited behind a stack of old telephone directories. I pulled the container down and set it carefully on the desk. Every receipt and daily log remained neatly filed inside the metal casing. I opened the blue notebook to the exact dates corresponding to his signed claims. The numbers matched my precise daily records down to the last cent. There was no ambiguity left in the room. The paper he drafted contradicted itself when held against the dated invoices. He had written down dates that proved his ledger manipulation. I carried the signed letter back to the main room. Raymond watched me approach from his usual seat near the window. You understand the terms outlined in that notice, he said with absolute confidence. I placed his signed paper directly beside my blue logbook on the table. These figures do not align with the actual disbursements, I said quietly, pointing to the specific lines of ink. He frowned and leaned closer to inspect the margins. The silence in the room stretched thin and brittle. He realized his mistake too late. The written document damned his entire argument beyond repair. His fingers twitched against the edge of the table. I closed the metal box and secured the latch. No further argument was necessary on that bright morning in Sequim. The record spoke with quiet authority. The scarred oak table held the weight of 12 years. I placed the metal container directly in front of Raymond. He stared down at the tarnished lid with narrowed eyes. The room felt entirely silent except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. I unlocked the clasp with steady fingers. Blue notebooks spilled across the polished wood in neat chronological rows. Every single entry from room 4 sat beside a decade of financial logs. Raymond reached for his heavy black fountain pen. His hand hovered over the paper for a long moment before dropping back to his lap. You brought me old school papers instead of actual money, he said. I slid a detailed accounting sheet across the grain. $14,500 is missing from my wages, I said. He squinted at the neat columns of figures and dates. You are just a dependent guest in this house, he muttered. Walter Cooper knocked twice on the glass pane of the back door. He pushed the wooden door open just enough to slide a small envelope onto the threshold. I brought the tool receipt you asked about yesterday, Walter said. He did not step inside or look for an argument. He simply closed the door again and walked back toward his own garden gate. Raymond pulled his gold pocket watch from his vest pocket. The brass casing clicked open to reveal a faded photograph of his late sister. His fingers trembled slightly against the metal rim. That watch belonged to his grandfather, but the numbers in my ledger belonged to nobody else. Children repeat what they hear at the kitchen table, I said quietly. Raymond lowered his head without another word. The accumulated record sat between us like an unpayable debt. Every receipt and daily note proved the truth beyond any further dispute. He laid his fountain pen flat against the scarred wood. Room 4 required absolute precision every single morning, but this room required absolute honesty at last. I did not raise my voice above a whisper. The metal box stayed open between our hands. He knew the totals matched every single hour I worked. 12 years of labor stood revealed in black and blue ink. He pushed the gold watch away from his plate. The gold pocket watch rested near the edge of the wood. Raymond did not touch it again. He looked down at his own calloused hands instead. 12 years of labor had left their mark on both of us. The room stayed very still. You cannot argue with arithmetic, I said softly. He let out a long breath through his nose. The ledger pages remained open to the final tallied column. Every single date matched the school calendar in room 4. He knew the records were entirely accurate. I packed the blue notebooks back into the metal container one by one. The metal clasp clicked shut with a sharp sound. I stood up from the wooden chair. My knees felt stiff from the long hours of waiting. Raymond stared at the empty space where the boxes had rested. He reached out and picked up his grandfather's watch with trembling fingers. He slid the brass casing into his vest pocket. He did not ask me to stay in the house. He did not offer any new terms or false promises. The front door stood unlocked down the dark hallway. I carried the metal box toward the exit without looking back. Outside, the evening air felt cool against my face. Walter Cooper was still tending his tools by the fence line. He raised one hand in a quiet gesture of greeting as I passed. He did not say a word about the trouble inside. He simply offered a steady nod before turning back to his work. The Sequim Valley stretched out under a darkening sky. I walked down the gravel path with my records secure in my arms. The reckoning required no shouting matches or dramatic threats. Truth arrived simply, carried in block letters and blue ink. Room 4 would open its doors again tomorrow morning. 20 children would sit at their little desks waiting for the bell. They would bring their own stories from home. They would repeat what they heard at their own kitchen tables. I walked past the garden gate and kept going. The kitchen stayed entirely quiet. The silence stretched between us. Raymond stared at the wood. His breathing sounded shallow and uneven. The bank printouts remained scattered near the metal tin. Every single calculation was completely finished. The financial proof was absolute and entirely undeniable. I could have called the county authorities right then. I could have locked him out of his own property permanently. That choice would have ruined everything he built over several decades of stubborn pride. I simply chose another path entirely. Revenge requires an enormous amount of bitter energy. It demands constant feeding day after day. I looked at the old man sitting across the scarred table. He looked very small. His shoulders curved inward beneath his worn flannel shirt. His duct-taped boots rested crookedly on the worn floorboards. Destroying him completely would not bring back those 12 years spent teaching in room 4. It would only tie my life to his failure forever. I gathered the loose papers instead. My fingers moved slowly across the surface of the marked wood. The room remained silent while the clock ticked softly. Walter watched from near the cast iron stove without speaking a word. He understood the heavy weight of what rested right there on the boards. Neither of us reached for the black telephone on the wall. The legal notices stayed right where they were on the desk. I closed the metal box with a soft click. The morning light caught the edge of the tin. The brass key turned smoothly in the integrated lock. I left the entire stack of financial proof sitting right beside the flour bin. Raymond did not look up as I picked up my woolen coat. He simply stared at the grain of the wood beneath his trembling hands. Some battles are simply not worth fighting to the bitter end. Winning them leaves you stained by the very things you fought against. I walked out the back door into the fresh Sequim air. The morning fog was lifting slowly from the green valley fields. Room 4 waited for me down the road. The children would arrive soon enough for morning circle. They deserved a teacher who was free of old grudges. I left the house behind without a single backward glance. My name was still Silas Sterling. I still knew how to keep a proper daily record. That knowledge belonged entirely to me now. No heavy ledger could ever measure what actually mattered in the end. The children would walk through the school doors soon. I had my own classroom to prepare before the bell rang. Letting go of anger is a quiet discipline. It has nothing to do with forgiveness or sudden mercy. It is simply a choice to walk away from a trap. I left the keys and the papers on the table. Raymond could keep his house and his ledger. I truly needed none of those old things to start over completely. The morning sun cleared the ridge. Shadows shortened across the gravel path. The air felt cool and clean against my face. Walter nodded once as I passed the garden gate. I kept walking toward the schoolhouse. My blue notebook rested safely in my coat pocket. Everything else belonged to yesterday. There is no victory in destroying another person. The cost is always too high to pay. I preferred the quiet certainty of my own classroom. The chalk dust and the small chairs were waiting for me. The gravel crunched softly under my boots. I closed the gate behind me. The morning bell rang across the valley. 20 children settled into their small wooden chairs in room 4. I placed my blue logbook on the edge of the desk. Attendance was complete. No one spoke above a whisper. Outside the tall windows, the damp grass stretched toward the old fence line while the fog slowly lifted from the valley floor. The house near the garden gate stood entirely quiet. Raymond no longer walked the yard with his heavy stride. His boots needed no more repairs. The chalkboard was clean and ready for the first lesson of the day. The bright room smelled of fresh chalk dust and clean white paper. He sauntered past my classroom window shortly before midday, holding a small cardboard box rather than rusted metal tools. He stopped by the door and knocked once against the frame. I stepped closer and slowly opened it. Walter looked down at his boots with a faint expression of relief. "I found these old records in the shed," Walter said, holding out a bundle of papers. "They belonged to the district from years ago." He handed them across the sill. I took them without a word. After carrying the weight of someone else's secrets for over a decade, Walter finally looked lighter as he turned back toward his own garden. Later that evening, I returned to the empty kitchen. The scarred oak table held only a single item. Raymond had left his gold pocket watch resting directly beside the flour bin. The heavy metal case caught the fading light through the glass. The ticking had stopped long ago. I picked it up carefully in my palm. The glass cover was clear and unscratched. Unlike the broken promises and false columns that had defined the house for so long, this timepiece carried a genuine craftsmanship beneath its tarnished surface. I traced the smooth outer rim with my thumb before setting it back down on the wood. The room stayed silent around me. No one argued over columns of figures. No letters demanded impossible hours of unpaid labor. Returning to the front room, I laid my blue notebook upon the shelf. The steel vessel rested silently next to it. My daily notes were complete for the day. Tomorrow would bring another morning in room 4. The children would arrive with their small coats and heavy backpacks. When the first bell rang across the valley, 20 children would take their seats without knowing anything about ledgers or ruined plans. I closed the wooden door behind me and stepped out into the cool evening air. Sequim stayed quiet under the pale sky. The road outside remained empty of visitors. I walked along the fence line and listened to the wind moving through the pine trees. Nothing more was required. The balance sheet of my life had finally turned a clean page. I stood there for a long moment watching the stars appear above the ridge. The evening air felt cool against my face. You listen to stories about people who take their revenge with a loud crash. That is not how a quiet life mends itself. Carrying the metallic container and the blue logbooks from room 4, I descended the rear stairs. You might think I kept all those heavy records to prove a lasting point to everyone watching across the valley. I did not. The heavy brass clasp clicked open for the very last time. I dumped every receipt straight into the municipal burn bin behind the fence. You watched young children repeatedly say those heavy lessons they never should have heard spoken aloud around the old wooden kitchen table. The bright flames caught quickly. You see how easy it is to let the heavy weight vanish. I stood there until the fire died down to gray ash. You do not need to keep a single financial ledger once your weary hands are finally completely empty and clean. The wind carried the dark flakes away. My desk was bare.